The politics of race, identity politics generally, is threatening the idea of justice in the West. With people identifying so fiercely with race or gender or whatever, the pressure is on simply to punish people of one group to placate another, and never mind the evidence. And right now in Minneapolis in the US, a jury is deciding its verdict in the trial of police officer Derek Chauvin, accused of murdering George Floyd by putting his knee on Floyd's neck and shoulder for more than 9 minutes during an arrest. Now, journalists ever since have said that Chauvin killed Floyd, when in fact that's exactly one of the questions at issue in this trial. Did he really? Because the defence argued that Floyd also had an enlarged heart, had taken a lethal dose of the drug fentanyl, and had complained several times, in fact, that he couldn't breathe even before police wrestled him to the ground. But the prosecution made it seem that what counted here was not facts like that, but how callous Chauvin seemed.
That Mr. Floyd died because his heart was too big. You heard that testimony. And now, having seen all the evidence, having heard all the evidence, you know the truth. And the truth of the matter is that the reason George Floyd is dead is because Mr. Chauvin's heart was too small.
Now, maybe Chauvin did kill Floyd. I didn't hear all the evidence, but I wonder if this jury would even dare consider whether he is innocent of murder, because I reckon they must be very scared. They've seen race mobs burn their city in protest at Floyd's death. Just last week, more protesters set fire to a building in the neighbourhood where, coincidentally, one juror lives. Other protesters smeared pig's blood over a house where one of Chauvin's defence witnesses once lived. And businesses in Minneapolis are now preparing for more violence and arson and looting if Chauvin is not found guilty. Protesters are already in the streets of the city, and the governor pleaded for peace and seemed to me to be hoping for a guilty verdict.
We cannot allow civil unrest to descend into chaos. We must protect life and property. But we also must understand very clearly, if we don't listen to those communities in pain and those people on the streets, many of whom were arrested for speaking a fundamental truth, that we must change, or we will be right back here again.
Now, one Democrat congresswoman, Maxine Waters, she's got a history of race baiting. She even urged protesters in Minneapolis to go in even harder if the jurors did not find Chauvin guilty of murder.
What should protesters do?
Well, we got to stay on the street, and we've got to get more active. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we mean business.
Now, Chauvin's lawyer protested at this outrageous incitement to violence, something that would intimidate jurors if they heard of it, and the judge agreed it was outrageous.
Now that we have U.S. representatives threatening acts of violence in relation to this specific case, it's mind-boggling to me, Judge.
Well, I'll give you that Congresswoman Waters may have given you something on appeal that may result in this whole trial being overturned.
But the judge said he wasn't going to rule on there was a mistrial because he'd told the jurors not to pay attention to the news, and we all know that jurors would listen to the judge, don't we? Joining me from Minneapolis is Sky News US correspondent Annelise Nielsen. Annelise, it's great to see you. The pressure on those jurors to convict Chauvin, regardless of the evidence, I mean, the evidence might obviously lead to a guilty verdict, I'm not saying that, but the pressure on them to convict seems immense. I wouldn't blame them for feeling scared if they didn't convict.
Well, look, these were all considerations made during the jury selection process, which is much more open than what we see in Australia. Each juror was asked to fill out a 14-page questionnaire, but the idea that there could be a threat to their security was prefaced by the judge, and in that he's actually not had any of the jurors shown in the live feed. And there is a suppression on their identities that will last until he lifts that order, and that could be indefinite. And so this is going to be the real test for these jurors, is how they continue. While you see all this political pressure, I'm sure that they would have seen, like we did, the protesters going around the city. And one of the interesting things too was when they were selecting these jurors, they didn't want anyone who was removed from having seen what happened last year or indeed having an opinion before. A lot of the questionnaires were about whether they would feel comfortable changing their mind or whether they would go against the norm. And so what this is really tested has been the resolve of the community, but at the same time, you need people within the community to pass this judgment. You can't outsource justice. They did try to move the case even to another state, but they said it was important for this community to be able to say what they think is the acceptable standard for their police.
Yeah, it really sounds like To Kill a Mockingbird sort of territory we're in here now. Chauvin faces 3 charges. What do the jurors have to decide between here?
Well, it's either second-degree murder, third-degree murder, or a charge of manslaughter. And the second-degree murder one is the highest bar to clear its 40-year sentence, possibly, but potentially even higher if the jury finds that there's aggravating circumstances. And so that's the charge that will be the most difficult one for the jury to come to, in that they have to decide that he was within the course of committing an assault that was likely to inflict grievous bodily harm. And in that process, he unintentionally killed George Floyd. Now, the third-degree murder charge is the really interesting one because it's really a law designed to pin drug dealers mainly. It's acting in a way that's dangerous to others, and in that you're likely to cause serious harm or death. And that's been the really interesting discussion around that. They did try to strike out that charge early on, and then it was reinstated after the prosecution request, but that was also appealed to a higher court that then implemented it as well. So that's certainly not a given. And then the manslaughter one is probably the most likely charge, but that one would only come with a 10-year sentence unless further aggravating circumstances are found. So there's nothing simple about what the jury is having to do. That was the bulk of what we heard in the closing statements yesterday about whether what evidence they'd seen applied to the specifics of those charges.
Annelise, what do you think the consequences will be either way if the jury finds Chauvin guilty of murder or if it does not?
I think it would be bold to think it'll be over once we get a verdict. It's likely to be appealed, as you heard. Even just the comments of that congresswoman could see it appealed. Although it's not unusual for a defence lawyer, to try it in the dying breaths of a trial to call for a mistrial, because it's a bit of a Hail Mary pass. But what we've seen is just how febrile this has gotten in the United States. Right around Minneapolis, all the windows are boarded up. Even the downtown area is completely dead. There wasn't even traffic around that protest yesterday because people are just avoiding the area. It was only right at the end that came up. But this has impacted so many Americans. Even small businesses around Minneapolis we've seen have been sending out emails saying that they're not working this week because they're just too upset by what's happened. And it's a real reckoning for the United States. The idea that a guilty verdict too will heal those wounds, I think, is a bit preemptive.
And now this politician, Maxine Waters, from the Democrats, who told protesters to go in harder if the jurors do not convict of murder, manslaughter was not enough. Are the Democrats saying that this incitement was wrong? I mean, I just think in Australian context, it's almost unbelievable to think that there'd be politicians standing outside a courtroom urging, protesters go in hard if the verdict doesn't go their way. Have there been any apologies, any admission of error here?
No, and the whole system's pretty bizarre. This is the first time Minnesota's ever had a full live stream of a criminal trial. People have been watching the gavel-to-gavel coverage, they call it. There are so many things that are completely foreign to an Australian audience. Even we've seen that they've had different issues with... Sorry, I'm having a bit of a brain fart, Andrew. Making sure that they can find jurors who haven't been impacted by any of the coverage. But it's very late here, but it's been so saturated, the market here. But they have judges who run for office as well. They have political platforms, and this is why this judge was seen as very a good set of hands to be holding this trial. He's seen as very fair, and he's not seen as overly politicised, although he did work quite briefly for a Democratic contender, Amy Klobuchar, in the last presidential primary. So no one's immune from politics here, but it's all very open. And even the fact you get to grill jurors on what their political inclinations are, whether they have any prejudice, and that's under oath. They can be found, and they do research these jurors as well. They can be found if they're lying to be struck out. And so it's, you'd say, at least a more comprehensive process.
And just finally, Annelise, I know that you've got US citizenship. You're not a stranger to the US. But spent most of your life in Australia. Coming back, race politics in the US, It seems from this distance to be more explosive in America than it's been for many years. Has that struck you too? And why do you reckon that would be?
It does feel like a generational reckoning, and a lot of it, from when we've spoken to members of the local African American community in particular, is that they're told that things are equal now, and they don't feel that that's the case. And so when stuff like this comes up, it just really riles them. I spoke to one African American man yesterday who was in his 60s, and he said that even in his early days, that his mother told him, whatever happened, if you ever came across a police officer, just do whatever they said, because no one was going to protect you and you needed to get out alive. The difference now is that people are filming these interactions, they're going viral online, and so they're not being brushed under the carpet as much as they used to be. But this is only very recent memory in the United States. Even, I think I mentioned before, my dad went to school in Chicago, and that was a segregated school. So this is living memory of when he was part of that reintegration, which of course he welcomed. But it's been not a long time that they've had these issues in the United States. There's still calls for reparations among African American community, and the incarceration rate of African Americans is incredibly high compared to the rest of the population, and you cannot ignore that factor either. This all builds up into that kind of underlying frustration, and then when something like what happens to George Floyd happens, it just takes off.
Annelise Nielsen, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.